Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Nancy Easterbrook. I'm Executive Director of Silicon Valley Directors Exchange. Thank you so much for joining us today. Our session today is on board communication, safeguards, and pitfalls, best practices and lessons learned about virtual board meetings. SVDX is an organization dedicated to educational and networking programs for boards of directors. For more information, you can visit our website, www.svdx.org. I want to thank our co-host for this webinar, Diligent Corporation. And it is my pleasure to briefly introduce our speakers for today. Richard Blake is a partner at Wilson Sonsini, Goodrich & Rosati, where he practices corporate and securities law. Dottie Schindlinger is the executive director of the Diligent Institute and co-host of the Corporate Director podcast for Diligent Corporation. Additionally, Dottie was instrumental in developing the Board Effect platform. Amy Guggenheim Schenken is an experienced public company and private equity-backed corporate director, public company officer, president, and recognized expert in digital transformations. Our moderator for today, Dan Siciliano, is a successful technology CEO, founder, and entrepreneur. He is currently chairman of the board of the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco, chairman of SVDX, and a fellow at Stanford University. Today's session will run for 60 minutes. The presenters will speak for roughly 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will open up the Q&A portion. I do encourage you to use the Zoom feature of Q&A to submit your questions. Finally, we will be recording the session for future viewing on our website. And with that, I will pass it off to Dan.
Great. Thanks very much, Nancy. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think these are all pretty big regulars in the space of corporate governance, one way or another. And I'm going to just kick us off with an open-ended question. We're talking today about communication in the era of COVID, all the unusual constraints we have, the creativity we've had to deploy to manage, all the business that must be done for boards and all the complexity. And we'll hit on all those things. We're going to hit on, virtual meetings, the pragmatic issues, the legal issues, the building of trust. But I just want to open up with a question about what has surprised each of you, maybe in the last 6 or 7 months, in terms of board adaptations to this particular environment. And Dottie, I'm going to call on you to go first. And I have to throw in an additional piece of information. Well, first, I'm a big fan of Diligent, so I use Diligent with all the boards that I have, but I'm also a very big fan of Board Effect. And if people don't know this, Board Effect is an alternative platform really targeting nonprofits and similar organizations, and was acquired by Diligent a while ago. And Dottie is the co-founder of Board Effect. So kudos to you, and thank you for creating such a great product. And yay, I'm glad you landed inside Diligent. So if you go into Diligent and you don't see Dottie, you're clicking too fast through the information stuff that pops up for director education. Don't do that. Spend some time there. But so sorry, Dottie, I can even see you blushing on the screen. I didn't mean to call you out on that. But maybe you start and give us the surprise takeaways that you've had over the last few months, because I know you talked to lots of directors.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Dan, and thanks for that shout out. That was very nice of you. So yeah, I think maybe the most surprising thing for me personally in this whole experience has been the speed with which every single board overnight became a digital board. I've been working in this space for 15 years, and, we often sort of joke a little bit that change for boards is like dog years. It takes 7 years for everything that would take one within a staff team. And we just watched overnight every single board adapt to using all remote capabilities, using Zoom, using board portals, using other digital technologies to accomplish the things they would normally gather in person to do. And I think, of course, necessity is the mother of invention, right? I mean, I think when you have no other choice, you adapt. But it was kind of fascinating to see how well that went. And I think that was maybe not just a surprise to me, but maybe a surprise to many other boards. And in particular, I would say to corporate secretaries and governance professionals who sort of had kind of come up with this narrative that they all were very wedded to, that, well, we'll get there someday, but first so-and-so has to retire. And it turns out that that wasn't really true. What really needed to happen was better support and maybe a little bit of coaching and training and just a different set of expectations. And suddenly it could all happen. So we started at the beginning of the pandemic, right around early March, speaking with corporate directors to find out what did they find to be the most remarkable about this experience. And in fact, virtual board meetings was one of the main topics that they kept bringing up for us, that, they were really interested to figure out, not what Zoom platform to use. And I use Zoom sort of generically now. I think the way we use the word Kleenex, I think it's kind of become that. And of course, I think we all have 15 plugins installed on our computers for, Zoom and GoToMeeting and BlueJeans and WebEx and Teams and you name it. But, that's not the most important decision. There were lots of other things that kept coming up that were really pretty fascinating. Things like, how do you make sure that you're having a really meaningful strategic level conversation if we can't really clearly see body language and sort of read the tone in the room? There is no room. So how do we do that well? And I think boards found lots of ways to adapt to that. And in particular, making sure that you're looking at everyone's faces. I think that became a norm. And I'll speak as someone who, again, I've been doing this work remotely for 15 years and in person. And I've never been on camera this much in my life. I think we used to just use the phone. We just used to use the audio. Now it's sort of an assumption that we'll all be on camera all the time so that we can see one another. And that's a big change. I would say then there's a couple other things, and then I'd love to hear from the other panelists as well. There were some surprising things that I think really relate to governance about virtual board meetings. One was the realization that, board members are not alone necessarily in the spaces where they're participating in a board meeting. And so there have been situations in some of the conversations we have with directors where they could see someone walking in the background and they knew that that director wasn't using a headset. And so was that person clearly listening to the proceedings of the meeting, someone who's actually in attendance? Do they need to go in the minutes? These are real questions that I don't think we had a playbook for before all of this. And maybe we still need one. There's a lot about virtual governance that is quite different when you can't lock the door and ensure that all the people in the room are the only people hearing things. It changes things. So I think those were a couple of things that really stood out to me from this last few months.
Those are great. I really appreciate that. I'm gonna turn to Amy next, but I'll point out I agree with you about the odd effect of converting phone calls, what were phone calls, into now Zoom meetings. And we actually have some board members sometimes from Zoom who are on our calls. Don't panic about the trademark implications. It's not quite reached the point where it's interchangeable with Xerox and otherwise. But it is funny, my co-chair or my vice chair and I for the Federal Home Loan Bank have made a rule about times of day when we will presumptively be on the phone and not on Zoom. We're sometimes really early. So it is an interesting trend that you mentioned. I'll be curious to hear from others. But Amy, do you want to maybe give us your insight? And yours is very much on the ground inside boardrooms. So what have you seen?
Sure. So first, it's great to be here with you guys. I think the biggest surprise for me as I think about this sort of topic more broadly is the fact that the transactional work of the board is made, I think, in some ways vastly easier or potentially more effective and certainly more efficient by moving to virtual meetings. And I know we'll have more conversation about that. But the softer stuff that makes the chemistry of the board and the board do the work of the board, importantly, trust and relationship building, I think is vastly more difficult. And you have these, it's very interesting and somewhat, I don't know if surprise is the right word, but it's interesting for me when I put these two pieces together and I think about, at some point we will move past this pandemic and what sticks and what doesn't, and what do we pull forward, and what don't we pull forward. And when I boil it down, it's those two things. It's sort of the efficiency gains, effectiveness gains on the more transactional nature, and it's the difficulty of the the trust and the relation building and the chemistry of what is sort of can be the magic of a highly effective board. That's more difficult.
Thank you. And we'll definitely explore those other issues. I think we'll dive into that next. Richard, do you want to throw out anything that struck you or surprised you in the last 6 or 7 months?
Yeah, I was surprised. And again, I come at this as an advisor to boards. And so I'm not, maybe this is just my perception, but I have been surprised at how quickly it transitioned, as well as the productivity and the fact that it doesn't feel like we've really skipped a beat. You know, in addition to counseling corporate boards, I also do capital markets transactions, and I'll give sort of an example of like we've been used to in the past in that world, like getting together for drafting sessions to prepare, prospectuses for an IPO. And those we typically, get in the same room and we're hashing out and we're discussing and drafting, and that has all now gone online. And I think we've all been surprised at how productive we've been able to be, even though we're not in the same room. On the counter of it, I will, agree. We miss out on those little interactions that we have together. One of the companies that I used to work with was Pixar. I was involved in representing Pixar a long time ago, and was involved in the sale to Disney. And when Steve Jobs built the Pixar building, there was 2 floors and 2 wings, so 4 different sort of quadrants, and then a central area, and all of the bathrooms, all of the food, all of the conference rooms, all of the theaters were all in the middle. And he did that very purposefully to drive everyone to the center from time to time. And because those interactions needed to happen. I even asked my lawyer friends, like, okay, I know that creatively he wanted to do it for all the artists and directors and producers to interact with each other. But as a lawyer, like, did that make an effect to you? Like, and he's like, oh yeah, like we would bump in and people would stop me and say, hey, I know I owe you that. Or I'd see someone and say, hey, can you get me that thing that you were going to get me? And there's just very little of, there are those interactions before and after board meetings, board dinners even, where unless, the social aspect of it, unless we work really hard to do that online, that's a part that is missing right now. But otherwise, just the work, it's been amazing for me to see. The one thing that I will say is, and this comes off a little bit of what Dottie said, that there are a number of, legal implications of, going so electronic. So a lot of people, and this is true even before the pandemic, but, how do boards communicate? A lot of times people are on, texting each other about things in between meetings, or using emails. And because we're not able to meet face to face, and because we get so used to communicating through email and what have you, there are some topics that that probably are best dealt with verbally, and not, on the phone or in a Zoom meeting, and probably should not necessarily be hashed out over email. And I know very few boards and companies who've sort of sat down and said, okay, here's a categorization of, things that we're going to, handle, on the phone or on a meeting, and that we don't want to necessarily have a paper trail for that's discoverable. And that's probably, and it gets into these issues of confidentiality and who's listening in to the call, or to the, who's walking in on the Zoom meeting that Dottie mentioned. But, that's something that I think there's some hygiene that I think every company could go through and sort of sit down and think about, okay, what are the topics that we probably ought to be more careful about in what we're emailing and texting and chatting about, and what items should we be talking about in person, over the phone, or in a meeting.
Great. Now, Richard, that's fantastic. In fact, as is our custom at SVDX, and with a nod to Joe Grunfest at Stanford, who kind of made this a habit, I want to tease out the takeaways as we highlight them. And I think, Richard, you just gave our more explicit first takeaway, which is, if you haven't done so as a board or as management or together, to spell out types of interactive communications that are required and the appropriate fit with the tool or method. If you haven't sat down to do that, that can be not just smart from a legal hygiene viewpoint, but smart from an effectiveness viewpoint, because there's not just legal considerations, there's consistency, speed, efficiency, follow-up, et cetera. And it's easier than it sounds, frankly, because lots of people have started to tackle this. So there's some templates to think about it. So that'll be our first takeaway is if you haven't done that, you should probably have an overt effort to make some of those decisions. This by phone, that by video, this never by video, et cetera. So I want to run a poll. We're going to talk now about virtual meetings, including frequency and the like. And I think that'll be my first effort is frequency. But we want to ask a general poll of everyone who's attending about the productivity in their view of the recent months of the switch to virtual board meetings. And it's just simple, more or less productive in recent months, more, neutral, less. No opinion. So how do you think those virtual board meetings have been in terms of productivity? We'll give you a few seconds to go ahead and answer that, and then we will we'll allow Nancy to go ahead and give us the tabulation. Here it comes. All right, so it's interesting. Most people, not quite the majority, think they've been more productive. We've got, balanced 30% neutral, and then 17. So a little less than 1 in 5 think they're less productive, and then good 1 out of 10, no opinion. That's really helpful. Okay, so we might reflect on that a little bit and note, setting up the conversation about 10 minutes from now, that doesn't say that they are more likely to enhance overall effectiveness or trust or outcomes. That's a very different question, as we know. Sometimes efficiency and productivity do not equal those things. So let me go ahead and ask maybe Amy, if you'd be willing, and then we'll go to Dottie, to talk about what your experience was about the frequency and duration and the touch points that came of both our switch to virtual, but maybe the causation's a little bit more complicated in that, entering such a complicated time. You want to reflect on that for us?
Yeah, sure. You're quite right to point out both, because and certainly I would say in terms of the frequency, it's changed over time, and it's also I think bespoke to the company and what's going on with the company. So I'll just use the example of the public board I'm on. So we went very quickly in March to weekly meetings and communications, but that it lasted for probably about a month, and then we started moving to slightly more infrequent. But this was after quarterly meetings with an annual strategy session, so it was a very, very quick pivot. But the move towards shorter, more frequent meetings, I think, has been consistent. The intensity of those, to your point, Dan, depends on the sort of intensity of what's going on. So yeah, I would say that on the frequency, and happy to comment also on just sort of other things that have changed to make those kinds of meetings more effective as well, but I can also hold that.
Yeah, let's come back to that. And I think we'll want to enumerate some ideas or best practices that we've run into. Dottie, do you want to comment? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Dan, and one other thing. So there's the shorter, more frequent board meetings, but some of the other things that I've been doing, and particularly with my private boards, are setting up a every other week meeting with the CEO, and in one case, the CMO, so that we have more frequent check-ins, because the pace of change has dramatically increased. We're making decisions with greater uncertainty, and it just feels right to have more consistent, constant communication. So what I've done in the case of one of my private boards, or both of them actually, put the meetings on the calendar. If we need them, we need them, and if we don't, we don't. And I found that to be, and the teams have found that to be an effective tool as well.
That's great. Good. Dottie, do you want to add a little to that?
Yeah, I mean, just echoing what Amy just said, this was very much what we were hearing again and again in our Ask a Director series. So most of the directors we spoke with were directors of both a combination of public and private companies. And all of them across the board remarked that they were having more interaction than ever before. sometimes with management, sometimes in committee, sometimes as a board, but it was almost on a weekly cadence for just about all of them. One thing we definitely heard, particularly from the public company board members, was that not every single one of those touch points was considered a meeting. So for the perspective of attendance records and things like that, that would be untenable if you were forcing every director to meet every single week. That's not really the right approach. But there were updates all the time. And they generally, accompanied some type of a quick conversation just to share some of the information that was happening within the company. In terms of the efficiency of the online meetings, again, what we heard there, most of the directors agreed that the online meetings were more efficient, but it's kind of hard to parse whether that has anything at all to do with the technology or whether it has more to do with what they were discussing. Because again, our research was really happening right at the start of the pandemic when, it was like all hands on deck focused on crisis response. And so I think in that kind of, to use Amy's word from a moment ago, that kind of a transactional meeting, it is going to be very efficient. You're not going to have very long, lengthy conversations really about many topics. You want to get the updates. You want to know, how are we trending? What action needs to be taken, and then you want to adjourn and kind of go and do it. So we were seeing that was becoming kind of the norm. I think it's very interesting now. We're just about finished with our sort of round 2 of this Ask a Director series. We wanted to go back and throughout September, speak to many of the same people we had spoken to before and new people to find out what's different now. Because of course now it's really no longer about short-term crisis response. It's now more about, long-term planning and how do we embrace just working with uncertainty as a principle. And that's a very different stance. And so we're curious to see kind of how that shakes out. Lots of boards have now had to onboard new members during this. Many of them have had to, hire and replace a chief executive during this time. All those things are quite new to do remotely. So it's going to be very interesting to see what the results look like. And hopefully that report will be available by end of November. But so far, the conversations we're having with people are that they're just really getting good at this. And they all lament not being able to get together in person for many reasons, but they all sort of remark on a shift from the default is that we get together in person and we only use virtual when we must, to we use virtual all the time and we only gather when we feel it's absolutely critical and we have to do it safely and masked and take precautions. And that's just a very different approach, I think. It'd be interesting to see how that plays out long term.
That's great. And we're going to have to invite you back for part 2 and you have those more robust follow-on results. And it's a really great point about the fact that once something appears sustaining, you start to adapt in ways that are different than if you had thought perhaps it would go on for 60 or 90 or 120 days. I'm going to ask a few questions that have been coming through just for kind of flow. And Richard, you're going to be first up for my question, but I want to throw out a framing for us to keep in mind as we talk through some of the next few questions and including the best practice or pointer ideas for making more effective and then maybe more cohesive oriented meetings. And that is, there's an old, story that circulates in the digital disruption space about, your grandmother, you go to Thanksgiving and, your grandmother always chops the turkey in half and like cooks in 2 parts. You ask yourself one day, you say, Grandma, why is it that you cut the turkey in half? And she pauses and says, oh, well, that's a funny story. In our first apartment in New York, we had such a tiny little oven that, we just developed, we always cut the turkey in half, but I guess now I don't have to do that anymore now that we live in this nice, and there's this notion that we are by our nature constrained by what we had to adhere to before. And I throw that out as an example. Something you mentioned, and maybe it is a takeaway, is that the intensity of Zoom meetings for any number of reasons, perhaps the topics, perhaps the moment in time, but also the physiology, and there's lots of good work about what face-to-face meetings do on camera, are more intense. And each of you mentioned in different ways that those tend to be broken up, perhaps. And of course, one of the reasons we set up long board meetings that ran one day, the next day, and the next day is because people would travel from far away. And it was sort of an efficiency strategy. It'd be silly to have people come from all over the world sometimes and, meet for 3 hours and then go home and then maybe next week come back for 3 hours. That would be impossible. But now, of course, that's kind of, you don't have to cut the turkey in half anymore. Perhaps you don't have to have 3 10-hour days. So I throw that framing out there so that we can kind of walk through it. But let me throw out a couple questions.
Hey, Dan, can I just say one quick thing on that? I just think that's what's such a fun and interesting thing about this time. I mean, because there is so much disruption and so much change, everything has been thrown in the air, and it allows us to question, why are we doing it this way, across the board. And I just think, there's so much innovation and good thinking, and it's just like you're, shaking off the dusty tablecloth. I mean, it's in fact, and it relates to, how you conduct board meetings. It also relates to the strategy in a company and change management. I spent a lot of time in digital transformation. One of the things that's really hard about digital transformation is the cultural change that has to happen within a company to get people to try to do things new ways and think new ways. And we're all in this situation right now where we're forced to. And so I feel like there's so much upside right now in terms of just a great rethink of how we do so many things that is really exciting.
I won't attribute it because I don't particularly like the author of this particular phrase, but you don't want to let a crisis go to waste in terms of your opportunity to really make some great changes. And I think that's your point, Amy. So we're getting some really great questions and suggestions, and I want to get to a couple of the blocking and tackling ones. Richard, you're up first. I'm actually going to, I think this question came from Charles Kenmore, but there have been others related to it. Can you give us the modernized update of virtual meetings running into the same old debate, which is worthy, but it's an old debate about minute taking, books and records, what you keep, what you don't. Now, it's pretty settled that you don't want any director sitting in a board meeting saying, I just love this stuff so much, I want to review it afterwards, and sticking a tape recorder in the middle of the table saying, just for my use, don't worry about it. Richard, I'm pretty sure you would say, oh, no, not that. But can you tie all that to what are best practices or maybe mistakes that, in your opinion, about the current environment?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of recording board meetings, at least that are not deleted very quickly thereafter, just for discoverability purposes. The minutes really should be the official record of the meeting. But you're right, there's been a long debate. And I think companies take different approaches about this in different ways about, okay, note taking around minutes. Okay, I hand out a board book and a director scribbles notes on it throughout the entire meeting. Should he keep those notes? What should we do with those? And I think, different companies have different approaches. There are some companies that say, look, we just as a matter of principle, we don't want directors to keep notes of things just because of the discoverability. I think you really have to ask yourself, if it's something that's more mundane, is that really a problem for them to keep the notes? Or I guess I come at it from a perspective of, what's the likelihood that we're going to get into litigation about this, and that we're going to get a discovery request that says, give me not only all of your board presentations, but give me any notes that anybody who was at the meeting was taking. And once that litigation request comes in, you can't start. That's not the time to throw things away or to shred. You sort of, you can't do that. So if the notes are kept and people are able to refresh their recollection for a short period of time and then throw it away, that's one thing. Then the other real thing is what's the likelihood that we're going to get into litigation? And so think, what are those topics? Well, sort of the big bet the company sorts of things. Anytime there's a big transaction, a large corporate transaction like a financing event or an M&A activity or things like that, those are things that are likely to result in litigation. And so we typically try to tell directors, not only to up their confidentiality and make sure not to be talking about this to people that they shouldn't be talking to about it, but also to be very circumspect in what they write down and from coming out of a meeting and what they send in emails as well.
And so let me paraphrase maybe some takeaways, and then I have one more legal question for you. Then we promise not to have too many more legal questions. It sounds like whatever you do, it's probably very context and specifically, determined by the company itself, which means it should be deliberate, a considered approach, around which there is either a policy or a norm, and hopefully run by the general counsel. Obviously, in some cases, because the corporate secretaries tend to be that. And I would point out one additional thing, which is the intersection of the tools that are available through the various portals and the like enhance the options of capture. And so if you have a policy, it should probably be updated, Richard, which you and I have talked about quite a bit. So here's a technical question. For those boards that differentiate between in-person and, and if they're old bylaws, they say telephonic. So they only have two choices. They have in-person and telephonic. Maybe they have another choice. And there's a differentiated voting requirement for certain matters across telephonic or other versus in-person. Do Zoom meetings now count as in-person? And is there any emerging law on that, right? Because it's a pretty serious constraint. If you have I would say actually in my experience, most boards don't have those separated constraints, but some do. Do you have a view?
Yeah, I think you'd have to look at the bylaws. I mean, I think we try to make sure that when the rules change to allow for remote meetings in Delaware, most companies are Delaware law. So when Delaware updated their code to say that you didn't have to actually be in the same room together to have a meeting, we tried to make the bylaws broad enough that it covered multiple sorts of scenarios and not just any sort of virtual thing. So I guess you'd have to look at your bylaws. Zoom meetings are not in-person meetings on the plain reading of that definition. You could probably get there that they're, you could say that they were telephonic in some way because that's some sort, but I think most bylaws, frankly, it's not just telephonic, it's some sort of, means of remote communication. And so there's not really going to be, I think a Zoom meeting or a video meeting is going to count for those sorts of purposes as an official meeting. So.
Got it. And so I want to jump to the questions, and there's a whole set of questions that fall into the category of building rapport, building trust, some good ones about onboarding directors, which we'll get to in a minute. But maybe, Nancy, if you are able to put up the poll around the building of trust or interactions for board members, we can start with the poll and then we can answer some of these questions. So how concerned are you about building trust in the absence of in-person meetings? So highly concerned, neutral, not concerned at all. And I think it's reasonable to construe trust to be a variety of things, rapport, connectedness, et cetera, in the capacity of trust. So we'll give a couple seconds for people to answer that. And then we have no less than 4 or 5 questions that get at that rather directly. All right, we'll show the results here. So there's concern, right? It's 83% of people are either highly concerned or concerned. So there is concern around this, which I think is what we've all been hearing. Why don't I start, perhaps, Dottie, you want to chime in about the way in which directors have both described the acuteness of this problem, maybe throw out a couple of things that have been done, and then I'll go to the questions. And I think the first question, Amy, I'm going to cue you up to give you a heads up on that. So Dottie, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, look, it absolutely is a place for concern, right? Because this interaction that we're having is different. There's no way around it. Even though the technology continues to get better, it's just never going to replace the face-to-face interaction, at least not yet. I don't know if anybody's ever seen the show Upload. Maybe once there was virtual suits that, replicate the feeling of touch, maybe then, but not now. So, it is a concern. And as you're onboarding new directors in particular, it becomes a concern because at the beginning of this pandemic, I think a lot of boards already had built a basis of trust and they could quickly pivot to an all virtual format because they already knew each other. And so it was just a different way to connect, not preferable necessarily, but they were fine. But as new people come in, that's where it gets really tricky. And I'd love to hear Amy actually talk a little bit about some of the onboarding strategies I know that they've gone through. But a couple of things that we've definitely heard and I personally have seen work well, having just social gatherings online can be very helpful. The one thing that's a little difficult is you can't really replicate a full board dinner, for example, over Zoom. Because one of the things that happens at a full board dinner is everyone talks at the same time. And that's sort of the one thing this technology is terrible at. We can't all have a conversation or it's just cacophony. You can't make out a single voice. But what you can do is and I've actually done this with my own board, and I've been a participant in a few of these. You can have like a wine and cheese reception, preferably with, maybe a sommelier or someone who can kind of walk you through some tasting. And then you can each kind of chat about that experience, both using the chat and, unmute yourself and have a conversation. And that's enjoyable. And it's a good way just to have a little camaraderie. It just doesn't, fully replace the sitting next to someone at dinner and really getting to know them. And so for the onboardings that we've had on the board that I serve, which is a nonprofit board, we've actually decided to do one-on-one Zoom meetings with each board member and the new incoming director. And we found that to be very successful. They also, of course, met with the key division leaders on the staff, but having that one-on-one time, even if it was just 15 or 20 minutes, really changed the dynamic because we all had a chance to get to know that person a little bit. And I'm sure for the person, it might have been a little exhausting, but they were happy to do it because then they got a chance to really get to know everybody on the board. So you do have to just, I think, bucket a little bit more time and be much more intentional about it to make it effective.
Great, thanks. Amy, do you want to throw out a couple of additions to that? Then I might ask you the specific question, I promise, but I'd love to hear your extension on what Dottie just shared.
Sure. I think the key word is intentionality. And I think this is another place where it's taking the kind of practices, the way you would onboard a board member, before COVID is not entirely different to how you'd want to onboard them during it. The mechanism is different, but in terms of onboarding, you want the board member to have time with other board members. You want them to have time with the CEO. You want him or her to have time with other executives and meeting customers. And all those things are made slightly more difficult. But what we've done is just, make sure that happens. And a lot of it is through, as Dottie said, one-on-one Zooms in each of those categories. The other thing is, we were onboarding a board member. He started in January, so we had one in-person board meeting, and then the rest now have been virtual. And we also have assigned a mentor, but we did that actually before before the lockdown happened. So I again think that's another area where that's probably just good practice, period. The trying out things, Dottie, we've done a board happy hour. It was one of the things actually I initiated because I had heard it as a best practice, and I thought it was kind of fun. You've just taken it to a new level by getting a sommelier to attend. I think I'm going to try that next time for sure.
So let me reference something that Richard said around Steve Jobs and the design of the Pixar buildings, right? So the architecture of meetings is something that matters. And in the same way that you have what some people refer to as happy collisions by design in physical space, we know that's really important. In fact, it's, some people contend that happy collisions are the source of innovation and productivity and insight and follow-up understanding in a way that, deliberate interactions are not. And so maybe if we could throw out a few ideas, it's taking this from some of the questions, where you think design strategies around the meeting as a whole enhance not just this trust building, but the potential for happy collisions. Now, mind you, the happy hour, the set aside time is sort of a interactive environment by design, but that's a little different from the happy collisions. I'll give you an example that I draw from the boards I'm on. For some of those boards, we actually have a make sure everything's working well period. That's right before, we do it a day or two before for real technical assistance, but we open everything up early. And there are several of us who make a point of joining in early. And during that, 15 or 30-minute lead up, people just start chatting, right? Because they're getting their coffee, they're making sure their sound works. And so this start early, open the Zoom early, is one method of just creating a happy collision environment. So Amy or Richard or Dottie, do you guys have suggestions around design of meetings? And one comment that came out is chopping meetings up, by the way. So that's its own natural need, both intensity, but also another way to do that. What other ideas should we share with everyone who's listening? Anyone can go first. I see Dottie, go ahead.
Go ahead,
Oh,
Richard.
sorry. Go ahead, Dottie. Okay. I was just going to say, I think because it's difficult to talk over other people virtually, and people, most people will put themselves deliberately on mute, and all these technologies show that people, are muted so that you will not be able to hear them. I think that those who are conducting the meetings, the chairman, the CEO, or whatever, really have to do a good job of drawing people out of meetings. I think about a few of the board meetings that I've been on, and there are usual suspects who will always make sure that their position is known, or that they're asking questions, or they're commenting. But I think that in a virtual world, even more than in an in-person world, it's important for those leading the meeting to draw out those who otherwise are just going to stick themselves on mute and say hello at the beginning and say goodbye at the end.
That's a really good point about the architecture of inclusiveness in conversation. Sounds like Richard's putting it at the feet of the chair or whoever's running it. But I've heard both you, Dottie, and Amy say that the virtual environment requires management in that way, but I can't remember who said it. Someone said, in some ways, there's an advantage about the virtual environment if you are, in fact, on top of this interactive inclusiveness. Dottie or Amy, do you want to comment on if that's true? And if so, what's the to-do here? Like, how do you make that into a deliberate action?
Yeah, Amy, I'll probably defer that one to you. I was going to maybe take it in a slightly different direction and suggest something that I know Richard is going to hate. So maybe it's
That
exciting.
sounds more exciting than
Yeah. Go.
Go ahead.
Well, so one of the things that I've been finding with the board that I'm on. So I serve on a small nonprofit board, but we're in the process right now of looking for our next chief executive, which is super fun to do in the middle of a pandemic when we're all working remotely. And we have this very active search committee, and quite frankly, we already meet once a week, and there's still a lot that has to happen in between those meetings. And so we've been making use of the secure chat area in our board platform to have conversations about things that we're just moving progress forward on. And it's mostly, a place for sort of task checking, right? So did you get a chance to review this? Do you have questions about it? And just checking in with each other. We feel comfortable doing that in that space because it's all completely encrypted and it's kind of controlled within the confines of the board portal system. So, the corporate secretary can manage that and kind of have that. Again, I know I can see Richard smiling. He's going to hate this idea, but it really has been the only way for us to do this work together, since we can't get together and have longer meetings and really hammer things out. And it's been very efficient and effective for us.
I want to ask Richard a narrow question. Wait, Richard, before you comment, I want to ask you a narrow question to maybe dispel this notion that the general counsel's view and the productive board members' view are really all that separate. And here's the question, Richard, and these aren't made up facts. If the system or the method you do this allows you to absolutely gatekeep, so only certain people can be in on it, it is encrypted and it's secure, there's no way to get the information out or transferred around, and you can have a set policy for retention, which is uniform and absolute, and it's consistent and destroys at 10 days or 30 days or 90 days, and you have those policies and systems in place, would you be okay with that, Richard, as a conservative outside counsel for this environment?
Yeah, I mean, the question all comes down to destroyability, right? Because if there's I think one thing that we often hear about the virtual world, the digital world, is it's never completely erased. You can't, you can take a piece of paper and put it through a shredder, and shred it up in a way that nobody's going to get it back. I mean,
only if it's multi-crosscut, just for the record, throw away all your shredders.
That's right. No,
go ahead.
That is true. That is true. So yeah, that's the question is, and some people, I'd see a comment just came up, people can screenshot content. So even if somebody's deleting it off of a system, if somebody's screenshot it and has it in their iPhone, camera. So, I mean, look, you have to, it's a risk, cost benefit, risk reward analysis. And the question, for things that are more administrative or whatever, that's great. For things that, it's like, do we want this, if this all goes south, do we want this showing up in court? That's the question you have to ask yourself.
I mean, maybe to put one little caveat on that is, we do make sure we kind of came up with some sort of operating rules around it. There are lots of things that we will only talk about when we're in meetings, right? So there's a number of things that we just sort of draw the line and say, this is not the appropriate forum. Let's make sure that we're talking about this in meetings. And we say that in a meeting, not writing those rules down. But I have to be honest and say, if we were not doing it this way in this controlled, encrypted, perfectly appropriate for board usage environment, we'd be emailing each other. And that is not a good answer. That's not the right thing to do. And so, yeah. So
those are not encrypted and
right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And, and lots of my committee members have AOL accounts and Hotmail. And I think, so we had to kind of, figure out which was the bigger risk. And this one works for us. And I think it's exactly right. We try to hold ourselves accountable to anything we write in here. How would we feel if it was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal? And that kind of keeps us on the straight and narrow. And, to the point about taking screenshots, right? It's generally not a good idea to look for a technological solution for bad behavioral practices. So you just got to do the right things.
And Dottie, to your point about bad behavioral practices, back to the original, best practice that I think Richard alluded to, policy setting on these matters is important. My experience is most directors are very eager to comply and behave appropriately so long as they understand it. But maybe people are in the habit of taking screenshots because stuff moves too fast or whatever, but addressing the policy level often takes care of it. And then to your point, exactly, then you can't, as easily offset bad behavior. I want to ask Amy to expand a little bit more, if we would like, on the new board member onboarding strategies or ideas, or Dottie, you could comment on that. Any ideas you have? There's been several questions about it. We already have, Dottie, your thought, which is, one-on-one, right? So you did a series of one-on-ones with that new person. Amy, did you have anything to add to that, either from your experience or just your insight?
Yeah, I don't know if more than I already said in terms of, to me, it's sort of the surround sound of the kinds of exposures that you want that new board member to have. Part of it is that person getting to know the board, and part of it is that person getting to know the CEO and the management team and also customers. So I'm on the board, for example, of an industrial equipment auction business. A key part of our onboarding has always been for somebody to attend a live event auction, and we can't do that now. So thinking about, and being intentional about how you emulate those experiences. If you take the traditional, what excellence looks like in terms of onboarding a board member or a CEO, because I've been through both during this pandemic, and you try and replicate that online, there's pretty good solutions for a lot of it, but you have to be intentional. It happens over more time, and but I think it still works.
Thank you, Amy. I'm skipping around to the various questions as they come in. One question that we received was about the balance that you've seen or have experienced in board management presentations, so management presentations versus board interaction. And maybe we can even put a third category, board interaction of two types, kind of interaction over a problem versus strategic deep dive thinking. So what can you tell us about what we've observed of trends? And I think embedded in this is maybe a question about how do you rebalance or make sure you've got the right balance moving forward?
So I'd love to take that. I love this question because to me, this is one of the, again, sort of positive things that I feel like is coming out of this in terms of governance. So, there are a set of things that happen in a typical board meeting around, informing, and then there's a set of things around key decisions and fiduciary responsibilities. Inform can happen through putting a document up on a board portal and people reading it and commenting on it and bringing questions. To me, the most productive board meetings that I've been in are when there's an absolutely fantastic pre-read that happens before. People can now, comment on the pre-read before and raise questions, which gives more management more time to think about it. But the board meeting is structured to drive dialogue, debate, discussion, and decisions. And that's how the time is used. And I think that is the most beneficial way to use the time of the board, whether or not it's in person or not. But I feel like because we've been forced into shorter board meetings, we're more intentional about how we use the time. And to me, again, this is one of those things that I hope has long-lasting implications for better governance.
Dottie, did you want to throw in anything on that kind of observation? I think it's
Yeah,
great.
I think it's great. I couldn't agree more with Amy. I mean, just, it's exactly right. If there's so much that you can do on your own, you can sort of explore and read on your own. And then the purpose of coming together for a meeting is to actually, talk about the issues and come to decisions. I have this great notebook that sort of, I always sort of keep on my desk, which I keep a lot of notes in, meetings that could have been emails. And it's really true. I think, when we meet in person, there does seem to be this tendency towards having these very lengthy verbally presented reports that we all could have just read, on our own time, and then would have loved to come together to ask the questions about it and have discussions about some of the points in it. And that's a much more productive use of meeting time. Really treating meeting time as precious, I think, is a bit of a hallmark of this experience. And I hope that continues. I hope that's something we don't lose, that we really, to use Amy's point, just be very intentional about why are we meeting? What is it that we're actually hoping to accomplish? What's the goal? What do we want the outcomes to be? And the things that are just informational, let's keep them informational. They don't need to be things that get read to us. So I'm hopeful that is a change that we continue on with from here.
And I've heard in a lot of board meetings, my own and others, the phrase "taken as read" uttered quite a bit more, right? And I would observe that a lot of senior managers, I think, embrace and are more excited by the opportunity not to go through their PowerPoint page by page, but rather to engage in dialogue with the board and to take these pieces as read and then to go through and highlight and discuss. So in the category of other things that we've done that are innovative and are sort of because of, or at least taking advantage of this moment in time, Amy, I wonder if you would, again, I'm kind of paraphrasing some of the questions, would you outline any other things your boards have done with respect to changes of format, changes of content, changes of director education patterns, whatever it may be, that have come to be during this period of time, but maybe in a weird way you would have liked to have done it anyway, or you'll keep it moving forward?
Yeah, right. I guess in the category of would have liked to have done it anyway, there is a enhanced emphasis on the quality of the pre-read material. There is an enhanced emphasis on breaking up the meetings into shorter, more discrete meetings. And even like in our strategy session, we didn't actually do this. The CEO led a strategy session, and it was originally planned it was going to be I think a 2 or 3 day, probably a 3 or 4 day offsite, and she expanded it over over a month. And it was great. It was actually the best strategic plan that this company has come out with. I think greater onus on super clear agenda with really specific goals in terms of what you want to get out of the meeting. And also, even greater emphasis on using executive sessions well. All these things, all 4 of those things that I just mentioned, I think are things that, again, are important in the physical world as well. But we've needed to up our game, and that will serve us well going forward. Tactically on virtual meetings and how we've been conducting board meetings, one of the nice things about Zoom, and we've talked a little bit about this, is so much of communication is nonverbal. And the structure of a board table is not always excellent for being able to see everybody in the room and make eye contact and see what their face is telling you and what their body language is telling you. And there's so much that is involved in active listening. And Zoom is actually a reasonable, mechanism for it, assuming everybody can fit on one screen, or you get a big enough monitor to have everybody on one screen. It's also, I guess, a good forcing mechanisms to keep the meetings smaller, which I personally tend to like too, because I think smaller meetings tend to encourage better discussion. But the the eye contact and the ability to read the room as it is on Zoom is better. Making sure everybody is on video, giving a little bit of time for casual conversations we've talked about at the beginning and the end, or even during breaks. And the increased importance of the chair or the CEO or whoever is facilitating the meeting to do so in a really thoughtful manner, to make sure that he or she is reading the room, is asking questions like at the end, is there anything that we've not talked about that we should be talking about? Ways to draw out different points of view. I love the idea, again, I love this idea in in-person board meetings as well, for particularly challenging conversations or difficult conversations, assigning somebody to be the devil's advocate. It's not personal. I'm just the one who's assigned to bring up all the reasons why this M&A transaction may not be right for us when there's a lot of momentum to do it, or whatever the decision is. I think there's a lot of mechanisms that we are, would do well to use, are increasingly, incented to do. But again, these are things that we should pull forward and do when we're back in person, in whatever shape or form that looks like.
And it's an interesting observation, Amy. All the things you described, for those of us who've spent a career thinking about corporate governance and board operations and board meeting architecture, this moment in time is kind of a reason to bring all those forward, right? And to consider them. So that's actually a great segue to our last poll, and we're going to have just the last few minutes to wrap up. So maybe, Nancy was ready. So here's the after COVID-19 risk. After COVID-19 risk has receded entirely, will your board go back to all in-person meetings, interactions, do some in person, but more virtual than they would have, I guess, originally, do a lot more virtual and less in person, or go back to lots of conference calls and in person? I think that last one isn't meant to be snarky, but it comes off as a little, are you going to go back to the old school method? So let's see if we can get some answers to that. And then I'm going to ask maybe a last question about takeaways and your best advice in just a moment. Let's see what people say here. Okay. Interesting. Okay, so even after COVID risk has receded entirely, it sounds like, and Amy, you and Dottie both kind of gave a little foreshadow to this early on in the session, it might be that we prize in person, but we're thoughtful and we have a strong why, and then we do a lot of other stuff virtually. So I do want to ask one question that came up in many forums. People said meals, happy hours, we've mentioned that. Do you have any final piece of advice? For my boards, I found the happy medium was wine and chocolate. Eating in front of everyone was a little too complicated, but I shipped them wine and chocolate. And then we did a happy hour and director education. Did anything else work better or differently for any of your boards, or what you did, either Dottie or Amy?
Well, I will share one idea. I can't claim it. It wasn't mine, but it was one of the conversations that we had with directors, that their corporate secretary had done something quite brilliant when they were very first getting started with virtual meetings, and everybody was super nervous about whether the technology was going to work and how it was all going to play out. She created a virtual meeting bingo card. And basically anybody who got bingo because a cat walked across the screen or they were on mute and they were talking, once you got bingo, you won a prize. And so that definitely got everybody very engaged in watching for these foibles and calling them out and just having fun with it rather than getting so, serious about it or upset about it. We're all human. Technology's not perfect. Let's just laugh and move on. And that helped to take, I think, a lot of the sting out of the first few board meetings that they had. I just thought that was such a fun idea.
And one quick thing that will demonstrate my nerdiness, but I think this both goes to increase governance effectiveness, but also increase the amount of time that board members are spending together. We launched on one of my boards a speaker board education series where every 6 weeks or so we bring in a speaker to talk about topics like activism or enterprise risk management or ESG. And it's both a mechanism for all of us to spend more time together, but also actually bring in an expert on a topic that is of import to the board.
That's fantastic.
I find those, I would use the word fun. I find them fun.
I like that. That's fantastic. And I agree. That sounds fun. Not everyone would, but I think that sounds fun. So we're going to wrap up. I'm going to first, I'm going to ask each of you to give like a 10-second takeaway of, if you only do one thing, please consider or do this. So be thinking about that as I make a point of thanking Diligent, thanking Dottie, obviously, but also thanking Diligent, who's a sponsor of SVDX, and of course, Wilson Sonsini, who's a sponsor of SVDX, but Diligent particularly for this session today. I'm going to give you my one takeaway that's also going to answer my colleague's question, who's on the board with me. I think it's important that every board update and contemplate the appropriate policies about sharing, capturing, recording, a quick discussion and a deliberate, pinning down of items. Things like Otter and Happy Scribe are wonderful tools, but you need to decide and then give directions to participants in your meetings if they're okay to use. I don't know the right answer, yes or no, but you should have considered and arrived at an answer. So Amy, do you want to give one last comment?
Sure. My big thing is use this as an opportunity to ensure that the board meeting itself is used as a place for constructive debate and dialogue about the issues of most importance to the company, and push more of the inform to the pre-read and other mechanisms, and use the precious time of the board meeting well.
Thank you. Richard, I'm going to have you go next, and then Dottie's going to wrap up.
Yeah, this is tangential a little bit to what we've been talking about, but for a lot of companies, this really has been a crisis. And now that things are settling a little bit more, go back and look at your crisis response plan and see if there's anything that you would update for the next crisis. And for those companies for whom this hasn't been a crisis, go and look at your crisis response plan to see if, had it been a crisis, would you have been prepared and ready to go?
Wise words. Dottie, you get last word.
I would just say, don't be swayed by the idea that the video conference technology is the most important decision you have to make, right? There's lots of different tools you can leverage. Think cleverly about ways you can use whatever technology you already have available to you. And maybe think about embracing some new tools, analytics, dashboards. These things could be really meaningful right now to help you keep an eye on what's happening with the company and make sure you're doing the right things.
Fantastic. I just want to thank you three. This has been really fun. I appreciate your time and your wonderful wisdom, and also want to thank those who hung out for a couple extra minutes. Appreciate the extra time, and for everyone taking time to be a part of the webinar. Thank you so much.